Welcome again to NT and 90 and OT and 365. Today we're reading Genesis 22 through 24 and Matthew 22 through 24. Let's get started in Genesis. In Genesis 22, we see where God calls Abraham to go and sacrifice his son Isaac. It sounds pretty brutal. And this is the son that God had promised Abraham. But we see several things happening here. We see in verse 2, God giving the command, go and sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. The next morning, they go. We see obedience on the part of Abraham. But then we see in verse 5, Abraham says something interesting. He tells his servant, stay here, we will go to the mountain and worship there, and then we will come back. So he had trust that God was going to provide a sacrifice, or God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. But either way, he trusted that both he and Isaac would return from the mountain. In verse 12, we see God's response to Abraham's obedience. He said, you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. And this is critical. We even see Jesus talking about this in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Jesus said, and he who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. We're to love God even more than those people closest to us. God understands that we, ourselves, our sons, our daughters, our parents, are eternal. And so our holding on to them for this temporary life is so not in keeping faith with God. Doesn't mean we don't love them. We just are to love God more. Moving on, in chapter 23, we see now that Sarah has died. She lived a good long life, and now she has died. And Abraham needs a place to bury her. And so he wants to buy land for a tomb. And in verse 13, he buys that land. The people around him respected him greatly as a businessman, even as a friend, I think. And so when he asked for land, they're like, here's some land, I will give it to you. The owner of the land just says, I'll give you the land, it's no big deal. But Abraham understands the power of a gift. Had he received that blessing of the free land, he says, look, you owe me nothing. You don't have to give me anything in return. There's no favor expected. Someday there may be. We saw the same thing earlier when Abraham would not receive the spoils of war from the king of Sodom. He wanted the king of Sodom to have no claim to anything in Abram's life. No claim to have been a blessing in Abram's life. And so he understands the power of a gift, and that receiving a gift can at least give a perception of a debt where you maybe don't want one. And so he saw the importance of actually purchasing the land. So he did that. He wanted no perceived debt to any of the people of Canaan. And so he paid for the land. In Genesis 24, we see that Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Isaac is now approaching 40 years old. He's still single. And Abraham does not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite. One of the things that's been shown throughout really history is interfaith marriages don't work. It's not about an interracial marriage. Interracial marriages are throughout, even the genealogy of Jesus. They're fine. It's interfaith marriages that do not work. They will pull you away from your faith in God. If someone who is not a follower of God wants to marry you, tell them, look, I can't be with you unless you become a follower of God. And if they just show up at church one day and say, okay, I'm following God now, will you marry me now? No. Say, you attend church for a year. You attend every time the church is doing something. You get involved in Bible study. You show yourself faithful. I won't even sit with you at church. And at the end of that year, if they are faithful and committed to God, consider dating them then. But that's off our topic here. So Abraham sends his servant back to his family to find a wife. And when he arrives, he prays for success and a sign in verse 12. In verse 27, he gives praise for the answer to that prayer, which Rebekah was. And so here is Rebekah. We have obedience. And in verse 52, we have worship. Abraham's servant worshiped. So as he receives Rebekah to take back to Abraham and for Isaac, he does so. And Rebekah was, I think, a second cousin to Isaac, which was quite common in those days to marry a relatively close family member. And so tomorrow, on Monday, we will read Genesis 25 through 27. Today we also read Matthew 22 to 24. In Matthew 22, we have the parable of the wedding feast, and where the master had invited people to the wedding. They wouldn't come. Those people represent the Jewish people of that day. Many of them would not come. So he sends out his servant, find people in the street, bring them in. And so they fill the house. And then the master comes in and he finds a guest there not wearing wedding clothes. And he throws him out and into a description of hell. Throw him out into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So what are these wedding clothes? They're not actually cloth. The wedding clothes referred to here metaphorically are faith. The putting off the old self, the old clothes, and putting on the new self of Jesus Christ. That is our wedding clothes. And so if you've become a follower of Jesus, you are properly dressed for the wedding feast of the land. In verse 21 here, we get where Jesus is being questioned, and a Roman coin is brought to him, and he's asked, should you pay taxes to Caesar? He says, give me a coin. Whose face is on the coin? Caesar's. Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And he also says, and to God, give to God what belongs to God. So we've got the face of Caesar on the coin. We have the image of God on us. And so then we give ourselves to God. Just as the image of Caesar's on the coin, God's image is on us. And so we give ourselves to God. In Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40, we have the greatest commandment. It says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law, all of the prophets are based on this. You don't keep the law to get God's favor. You keep the law because you love God. That was true in the Old Testament. Now what do we do? Because we love God. We live for him. We live a proper life for him. Yes, that means there are some things we don't do, some things we do. Sometimes we don't want to do those things. Sometimes we want to do the things we shouldn't do. But we sacrifice that desire for God because we love him. And we love our neighbors ourselves. We let them go first. We care for them. We share what we have. That is love. In Matthew 23, Jesus criticizes the religious leaders. This whole chapter is Jesus criticizing the religious leaders primarily for hypocrisy, various forms of hypocrisy. They were very pious and holy on the outside in their outward appearance and their outward behavior. But inside, he said, they were full of greed and pride. That is not how we're supposed to be. We don't live the Christian life to impress other people or even to try to impress God. We live the Christian life because we love God and we love people. And we sacrifice for ourselves. We are a servant to God and to people, and not here to be served. Then in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about the signs of his return, or the end of the age. One of the key verses I saw there was verse 13. The one who endures to the end will be saved. That may be the end of our life. It may be the end of the age if he returns before we pass. But we're to endure as his followers to the end. In verse 14, here's the clearest sign of the approaching the end of the age. The good news of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it. and then the end will come. I'd say we're very close to accomplishing that, and we will see that happen. All the other signs mentioned there, earthquakes and famines and wars, it says these things are going to happen, but it's not the end yet. So those are not necessarily signs of the end. They're just things that are going to happen. Don't think it's the end just because these bad things are happening. The sign of the end is that the word will be preached to all nations. One of the other things I wanted to point out is in verse 24. It talks about for false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform great signs and wonders so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. And many people will follow them. And I know of different places in the world where there are so-called churches that have risen up where they claim their leader is Jesus reincarnated or Jesus returned. And then their leader gets old and dies. That's not Jesus. That's a lie. It's a false prophet. Do not follow these people. And so be very careful with that. And then he says, whenever somebody says, there's Jesus over there, here's the Messiah here he is here, don't follow them. And Jesus makes clear in verse 27, for as the lightning flashes in the east and shines to the west, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. When Jesus returns, every believer will know it. We will hear him, we will see him, doesn't matter where we are in the world. If you're asleep in your bed, if you're in a classroom, if you're at your work, it doesn't matter where you are, you will know when Jesus returns. You will see it, you will hear it at every place in the world. And no one knows the hour of the day or the day or the hour when he will return. Many people try to predict it. It's interesting to talk about what needs to happen before Jesus returns, and I love that conversation. But we don't know when he's coming back exactly. It might be today. It might be tomorrow. It might be next week, next year. It might be in 100 years or 1,000 years. We don't know. But I believe we're supposed to be ready right now. Don't wait to get ready. And so Jesus is coming back soon. That's what Peter and Paul believed. That's what I believe. And so I will see you again on Monday. Have a good weekend.